The morning had started like any other at the palace. Camilla stepped out of her private chambers just after 9 o'clock, her schedule packed with the usual engagements expected of someone in her position. She wore a cream-colored suit with pearl accessories, her hair perfectly styled as always. The staff moved quietly through the corridors, attending to their duties with practiced efficiency. Nobody could have predicted that within hours. Everything would change. The first signs of trouble appeared during a routine security briefing. Camilla had been reviewing documents in the drawing room when her private secretary entered with an unusual expression on his face. He whispered something to her that made her face go pale. She set down her teacup with a trembling hand and excused herself from the meeting. The other attendees exchanged confused glances but said nothing. In royal circles, discretion was everything. By midday, palace security had been notified of an irregularity. Financial records that should have been routine suddenly raised red flags during an internal audit. Someone had noticed discrepancies in charitable fund allocations, amounts that didn't match the official ledgers. The numbers were significant enough to warrant immediate investigation. When the auditors dug deeper, they found a pattern of transactions that all seemed to lead back to accounts associated with Camilla's private office. The palace protocol officer was the first to suggest that perhaps there had been a simple administrative error. These things happened, he insisted, especially when dealing with the volume of charitable work the royal family managed. But the head of security wasn't convinced. He had seen enough irregularities in his career to know when something deserved closer scrutiny. He made the decision to escalate the matter to higher authorities outside the palace walls. Camilla spent the afternoon attempting to maintain her composure during a garden party. She smiled and chatted with guests, discussing everything from the weather to upcoming cultural events. But those who knew her well noticed something was off. Her laugh seemed forced, her movements slightly too quick. She kept glancing toward the palace entrance as if expecting someone to arrive. When her phone buzzed repeatedly in her handbag, she ignored it, something she never did. The royal guard had been quietly gathering information throughout the day. They operated with the kind of discretion that came from years of protecting both the monarchy and the institution itself. By late afternoon, they had compiled enough evidence to warrant bringing in outside law enforcement. This was no longer just an internal matter. The amounts involved, if the preliminary findings were correct, crossed into criminal territory. When the authorities arrived at the palace gates just before 6 o'clock, they came in unmarked vehicles. The head of the royal guard met them in a private antechamber, away from prying eyes and curious staff members. He explained the situation in careful, measured tones. The officers listened intently, taking notes and asking pointed questions. They understood the sensitivity of the situation. This wasn't just any investigation. This involved someone at the very heart of the royal establishment. Camilla was in her private sitting room when the knock came at her door. She had dismissed her lady-in-waiting an hour earlier, claiming she needed time alone to review some papers. In truth, she had been pacing the room, her mind racing through scenarios and possibilities. When she opened the door, she found not her usual staff, but the head of the royal guard, accompanied by 2 plainclothes police officers. The conversation that followed was brief and painfully formal. The officers explained that serious allegations had come to light regarding financial improprieties. They needed her to accompany them for questioning. Camilla's first instinct was to refuse to assert her position and demand that this matter be handled differently. But the look on the guard commander's face told her that this was beyond anyone's control now. The machinery of justice had been set in motion. She asked for a moment to collect herself. They allowed her 5 minutes, with an officer stationed outside her door. Camilla sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection in the mirror. How had it come to this? She thought about the decisions she had made over the past 2 years, the advice she had received from people she trusted. She had believed she was acting in everyone's best interest. Now, those same actions were being viewed through a very different lens. When she emerged from her room, Camilla had regained some of her composure. She walked with her back straight, her chin slightly raised. The palace staff, who glimpsed her being escorted through the private corridors, would later describe the scene as surreal. Some thought perhaps she was ill and being taken to receive medical attention. Others sensed something more serious was happening. but couldn't imagine what. The journey through the palace seemed to take forever. Every corridor held memories. Every room represented years of her life spent in service and duty. Or so she had told herself. Now she wondered how others would remember this chapter of her story. Would they see dedication, or would they see something else entirely? The uncertainty gnawed at her. Outside, a discreet car waited in a private courtyard used only for sensitive departures. The royal guard had coordinated carefully to ensure no photographers or journalists witnessed this moment. The last thing anyone wanted was headlines before facts had been established. Camilla stepped into the vehicle without speaking, settling into the back seat between two officers. The door closed with a solid thunk that felt terribly final. As the car pulled away from the palace, Camilla looked back through the rear window. The building that had been her home, her workplace, her entire world, grew smaller in the distance. Staff members went about their evening duties, completely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. Life at the palace would continue, as it always did. The question was whether she would ever be part of it again. The drive to the police facility took 20 minutes through London's evening traffic. Camilla sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap. One of the officers attempted small talk, perhaps trying to ease the tension, but she didn't respond. Her mind was elsewhere, running through everything that had led to this moment. The investments that had seemed so promising, the advisors who had assured her everything was legitimate, the signatures she had provided on documents she hadn't fully understood. When they arrived at the secure facility, Camilla was led through a private entrance away from the main booking area. Even in these circumstances, certain protocols regarding her status were observed. She was taken to a comfortable interview room, nothing like the stark interrogation spaces shown in television dramas. There was a sofa, a table with water and glasses, even some biscuits on a plate. But the locked door and the camera in the corner made it clear this was not a social visit. A female officer explained the process that would unfold. Camilla would be interviewed under caution, meaning anything she said could be used as evidence. She had the right to legal representation, and in fact, arrangements were already being made for her solicitor to arrive. Until then, she would wait in this room. They would bring her dinner, the officer added, as if that detail mattered at all. Alone in the room, Camilla finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling. Years of building her reputation, of navigating the complex dynamics of royal life, of proving herself worthy of her position, all of it now hung in the balance. She thought about the headlines that would inevitably come, the speculation and judgment from people who had never met her but felt entitled to opinions about her life. Her solicitor arrived 90 minutes later, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret who had represented various members of high society over her long career. Margaret set down her briefcase and got straight to business. She needed to know everything, she explained. Every detail about the financial arrangements, who had advised Camilla what she had known and when she had known it. There was no room for embarrassment or protection of others now. The truth, whatever it was, needed to come out in this room before it came out anywhere else. Camilla began to talk, and once she started, everything poured out. She described how it had begun almost 2 years earlier, when a financial advisor had approached her with what seemed like a brilliant opportunity. Charitable funds could be invested in a way that would generate significant returns, he had explained. Those returns would then allow even more charitable work to be done. It seemed like a win-win situation. It's a way to maximize the impact of every pound donated. The advisor had impressive credentials and came highly recommended by someone Camilla trusted. He had presented detailed projections and financial models that looked completely legitimate. She had asked questions, of course, but his answers had been smooth and convincing. Looking back now, she could see warning signs she had missed. The pressure to make quick decisions, the complexity of the arrangements, the insistence on keeping certain aspects private to avoid bureaucratic interference. She had signed documents, authorized transactions, and provided access to accounts that held charitable funds. At the time, it had all seemed proper. The advisor had assured her that everything was being done legally and ethically. Regular reports showed impressive returns on the investments. The charity work had indeed expanded, which seemed to validate the entire approach. Camilla had even received praise for her innovative thinking in maximizing charitable impact. But somewhere along the way, things had gone wrong. Money that should have been returned to charitable accounts had instead disappeared into complex offshore arrangements. Returns that looked good on paper turned out to be fabricated. The advisor, she now realized, had been using her position and reputation to legitimize what was essentially a sophisticated fraud scheme. And she, trusting and perhaps naive, had been the perfect mark. Margaret listened without interrupting, taking detailed notes. When Camilla finished, the solicitor sat back and considered the situation carefully. The good news, if it could be called that, was that Camilla appeared to have been a victim of deception rather than an active participant in fraud. The bad news was that her position meant she would be held to a higher standard of accountability. Ignorance, even innocent ignorance, might not be an adequate defense. The formal interview began just before midnight. 2 detectives entered the room, introduced themselves, and activated the recording equipment. They proceeded methodically through questions about the financial arrangements, the timeline of events, and Camilla's understanding of what was happening. She answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging what she had known and admitting what she hadn't understood. Margaret occasionally interjected to clarify points or ensure questions were fair. As the hours wore on, Camilla felt exhaustion settling into her bones. The detectives were professional but persistent, circling back to certain topics, asking the same questions in different ways. They were looking for inconsistencies, testing her story against evidence they had already gathered. She realized they were trying to determine whether she had been genuinely deceived or had knowingly participated in wrongdoing. Around 3 in the morning, they took a break. Camilla was offered more water, tea, and sandwiches. She nibbled on a sandwich without tasting it, her mind numbed from the endless questions. Margaret used the break to confer privately with the detectives, trying to get a sense of where the investigation was heading. When she returned, her expression was carefully neutral, which told Camilla nothing had been resolved. The interview resumed and continued until dawn was breaking outside. Finally, the lead detective announced they had enough for now. Additional interviews would likely be necessary as the investigation continued, but for tonight, they were done. Camilla asked if she could go home. The detective exchanged glances with his colleague before explaining that she would be held pending further inquiries. The words hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't free to leave. She was moved to a different room, more comfortable than a cell, but still clearly a place of detention. There was a proper bed at least, and a private bathroom. Margaret promised to work on getting her released as quickly as possible, but she couldn't make any guarantees. The evidence situation was complex. Authorities were taking the matter very seriously, given Camilla's prominent position. Until investigators were satisfied she wasn't a flight risk and had cooperated fully, release wasn't assured. Alone again, Camilla lay down on the bed fully clothed. She stared at the ceiling, her mind refusing to quiet despite her physical exhaustion. Outside this room, she knew the world was waking up to what would soon be the biggest scandal to hit the royal family in years. Her name would be on every front page, her reputation dissected by strangers, her life's work reduced to a footnote beneath screaming. Headlines about corruption and betrayal. The morning brought chaos that no amount of palace protocol could contain. By 7 o'clock, news had leaked to the press. Nobody knew exactly who had spoken or how the information had gotten out. But suddenly every major news outlet was running breaking news alerts. Reporters gathered outside the police facility, their cameras trained on every entrance and exit. Helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial footage that would play on loop throughout the day. Inside the palace, emergency meetings convened before breakfast. Senior advisors, communications staff, and legal experts crowded into secure rooms, trying to understand the full scope of what had happened. Some had known about the investigation, but most were blindsided by how quickly things had escalated. The king was briefed in his private study, his face growing graver with each detail revealed. This wasn't just a scandal. This was a crisis that threatened the institution itself. Public reaction came swiftly and was sharply divided. Social media exploded with opinions from people who had never met Camilla but felt qualified to judge her guilt or innocence. Some defended her fiercely, arguing she had been set up, or that the whole thing was politically motivated. Others saw confirmation of suspicions they had harbored for years. The comment sections became battlegrounds where nuance and presumption of innocence were early casualties. In her detention room, Camilla remained unaware of the storm raging outside. She had finally fallen into a fitful sleep around 6 in the morning, her body simply unable to sustain consciousness any longer. When she woke 3 hours later, reality crashed back with crushing force. For a brief moment between sleep and waking, she had forgotten where she was. Then she saw the unfamiliar walls, felt the scratchy institutional bedding, remembered everything. A female officer brought breakfast on a tray. Toast, eggs, juice, and tea served on plain white dishes. The officer was young, probably in her mid-20s, and she seemed uncomfortable with the unusual situation of serving someone like Camilla. She set down the tray quickly and retreated without making eye contact. Camilla understood. What do you say to someone who was royalty yesterday and a suspect today? Margaret returned mid-morning with updates that were mostly discouraging. The investigation had expanded overnight. Financial investigators were now examining 3 years of transactions instead of just 2. They had brought in forensic accountants and were coordinating with international authorities to trace money through various offshore accounts. The advisor who had orchestrated the scheme had apparently fled the country, which made Camilla's cooperation even more crucial to building a case. The palace had released a brief statement expressing shock at the allegations and promising full cooperation with authorities. The statement carefully avoided any defense of Camilla, which Margaret noted was not a good sign. They were distancing themselves, protecting the institution even if it meant abandoning her. Camilla had expected this on some level, but it still stung. Years of service, of dedication, meant nothing when scandal threatened the crown. Margaret explained the legal strategy they needed to pursue. Camilla's best defense was positioning herself as a victim of fraud rather than a participant. They needed to demonstrate that she had been deceived by a sophisticated criminal, that she had acted in good faith based on false information. The challenge was that her position carried with it certain expectations of oversight and due diligence. A reasonable person in her situation should have asked more questions, should have insisted on more transparency. The detectives returned for another round of interviews in the early afternoon. This session focused on specific transactions, walking through bank statements and authorization forms line by line. They showed Camilla her own signature on documents she barely remembered signing. Each one felt like evidence of her carelessness, her willingness to trust people she should have vetted more carefully. The detectives were particularly interested in one large transfer that had occurred just 3 months earlier. Right before the fraud began to unravel, Camilla explained that the advisor had called her urgently about a time-sensitive investment opportunity. He had presented it as a chance to secure exceptional returns that would fund a new children's hospital wing. She'd been so focused on the charitable outcome that she hadn't scrutinized the mechanism. Looking at the paperwork now, she could see how vague the details were, how the language seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. She had been a fool, blinded by good intentions and misplaced trust. The lead detective leaned forward across the table. He asked her directly if she had received any personal benefit from these transactions. Had money flowed into her private accounts? Had she accepted gifts or payments from the advisor? Camilla met his eyes and answered clearly, no. Whatever had happened, she had not profited personally. Every penny was supposed to go to charitable purposes. That, at least, was something. The detective made a note, but his expression revealed nothing about whether he believed her. As the interview stretched on, Camilla felt herself becoming increasingly emotional. The stress of the situation, combined with lack of sleep and the relentless questioning, was breaking down her usual composure. When they brought up the children's hospital specifically, asking if she understood that sick children had been deprived of funding because of this scheme, tears finally came. She hadn't cried in front of anyone in years, but she couldn't stop herself now. The human cost of what had happened was overwhelming. Margaret called for a break, and the detectives agreed. Camilla was given time to compose herself in a washroom. She splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup long gone, her eyes red and swollen. This was not how she had ever imagined herself appearing before anyone, let alone police investigators and potentially the world. When the interview resumed, the focus shifted to other people involved in the scheme. The detectives wanted names of everyone Camilla had interacted with regarding the financial arrangements. They asked about the person who had recommended the advisor to her. That individual turned out to be someone she had known for decades, a trusted friend who moved in the same social circles. Had that friend been part of the fraud or another victim? Camilla honestly didn't know. They asked about palace staff who might have facilitated the transactions, her private secretary, her financial manager, various assistants who had handled paperwork and communications. Camilla realized with growing horror that her answers might implicate people who had simply been following her instructions. They had trusted her judgment, and she had led them into this disaster. How many lives would be destroyed by her mistakes? The afternoon wore on into evening, and still the questions continued. The detectives were building a comprehensive timeline, connecting dots, mapping out the entire scheme from beginning to end. Camilla understood this was necessary, but the process was mentally and emotionally exhausting. Every question felt like an accusation. Every document they showed her felt like proof of her inadequacy. Finally, around 8 o'clock, they concluded the second interview session. The lead detective explained that they would review all the information gathered so far and determine next steps. They would likely need to speak with her again, but for tonight, she could rest. Rest, Camilla thought bitterly, as if sleep was possible under these circumstances. But she thanked them politely, years of ingrained courtesy overriding everything else. Margaret stayed behind after the detectives left. She had arranged for Camilla to receive proper dinner and some personal items from the palace, including fresh clothes and toiletries. Small comforts, but they made a difference. Margaret also brought news from the outside world, though she hesitated before sharing it. The story had become an international sensation. Media outlets across Europe and America were covering it extensively. Camilla's life was being dissected publicly in the most invasive ways imaginable. There were calls for her to be stripped of titles, excluded from the family, prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. There were also defenders, people arguing that she deserved a fair hearing before being condemned. But the defenders were outnumbered and outshouted by those who seemed to relish the scandal. Margaret showed Camilla some of the headlines on her tablet, then quickly put it away when she saw Camilla's face crumble. They discussed what would happen next. Prosecutors would review all the evidence and decide whether to file formal charges. That decision could take days or even weeks. In the meantime, Camilla would likely be released on bail with conditions. She would have to surrender her passport, report regularly to authorities, and avoid contact with anyone else involved in the investigation. She would essentially be trapped, neither free nor formally accused, existing in a legal limbo while her fate was decided by others. The prospect of going home, even under those conditions, felt like a lifeline. Camilla asked when release might happen. Margaret explained they were working on it, but the authorities were being cautious. Given the high-profile nature of the case and the international dimensions of the financial fraud, they wanted to be absolutely certain that releasing her wouldn't compromise the investigation. Another day or two at minimum, Margaret estimated, possibly longer. That night, Camilla lay awake for hours despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept returning to specific moments over the past 2 years, seeing them now with terrible clarity. The advisor's slight hesitation when she asked certain questions. The way he had always steered conversations away from technical details. The offshore accounts that had seemed unnecessarily complicated, but which he had assured her were standard practice for international charitable work. She had wanted to believe him because the alternative was too terrible to consider. She thought about her position and how it had made her vulnerable. People like her were accustomed to a certain level of deference, to having their decisions accepted without excessive questioning. The advisor had understood this and exploited it masterfully. He had used her status against her. Knowing that someone in her position would be less likely to doubt a smooth-talking professional with impressive credentials, her privilege, it turned out, had been her greatest weakness. Sleep finally came in the early hours of morning, but it brought dreams that were worse than waking. She dreamed she was at a royal function, surrounded by guests who slowly realized she didn't belong there. Their faces turned cold, their whispers grew louder until finally guards came to escort her out. She woke with her heart pounding, disoriented, until she remembered that the nightmare was actually her reality. The third day of her detention began with a visit from someone unexpected. A senior palace official arrived mid-morning, a man named Charles, whom Camilla had worked with for years. He was shown into a room under guard supervision, and his face was a careful mask of professional neutrality. He had come, he explained, to discuss practical matters regarding her position in residence at the palace. Camilla felt a chill settle over her. This was it, the formal severing of ties. Charles proceeded with uncomfortable formality, explaining that, given the serious nature of the allegations, it had been decided that she should take an indefinite leave from all royal duties. Her apartments at the palace would need to be vacated. Alternative accommodation was being arranged, a private residence where she could stay during the investigation. The message was clear, even if the language was diplomatic. She was being cast out. She asked about her personal belongings, the things she had accumulated over years of residence. Charles assured her that everything would be carefully packed and moved to her new accommodation. Staff would handle it all. She needn't worry about logistics. The kindness in his voice, when he said this, made it somehow worse. They were being considerate while destroying her life, and she was expected to be grateful for their thoughtfulness. After Charles left, Camilla sat in stunned silence. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it felt like a physical blow. She was losing not just her position, but her home, her daily routines, her entire way of life. Everything that had defined her existence for so many years was being dismantled. She would become one of those people she had occasionally read about. Former members of the royal orbit, who faded into obscurity after falling from grace. Margaret arrived shortly after with better news. The prosecutors had agreed to release Camilla on bail pending the completion of their investigation. The conditions were strict but manageable. She would have to wear an electronic monitoring device, report to a police station twice weekly, and maintain no contact with any potential witnesses or co-conspirators. Her passport had been surrendered, but she could leave this place, and that was what mattered most. The paperwork took hours to process. Forms to sign, conditions to acknowledge, legal language to understand and agree to. Camilla signed everything mechanically, her mind already focused on getting out of this building. Margaret explained that a car would pick her up at the rear entrance to avoid the media circus still camped out front. They would take her directly to the new residence, where she could finally have some privacy and space to think. The electronic monitoring device was fitted to her ankle in a small room by a technician who worked quickly and professionally. The device was smaller than Camilla had imagined, but still visible, a constant reminder of her changed circumstances. She would wear it for months, possibly longer. It would track her movements, enforce the boundaries of where she was and wasn't allowed to go. She was on a leash now, tethered by technology and legal necessity. As evening approached, Camilla prepared to leave. She changed into the fresh clothes Margaret had brought, trying to make herself look presentable. Her hair was still a mess, and she had no makeup, but it would have to do. She couldn't stay in this place another night. The thought of her own space, even if it wasn't really her own, was intoxicating. She needed walls that didn't feel like they were closing in, doors she could lock from the inside, windows she could look out of without seeing guards. The walk through the facility to the rear exit felt eternal. Camilla kept her eyes straight ahead, aware of officers watching her pass. Some seemed sympathetic, others merely curious. She was a spectacle now, something to observe and discuss. The woman who had fallen from the highest heights, making mistakes that would be dissected and judged for years to come. She held her head up anyway, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. The car was waiting exactly where Margaret said it would be. A nondescript sedan with tinted windows, the driver already behind the wheel. Margaret opened the rear door and Camilla slid inside quickly. The door closed, sealing her away from the facility and its uncomfortable memories. The car pulled away smoothly and Camilla allowed herself one small moment of relief. She was leaving. Whatever came next. At least she wasn't trapped in those rooms anymore. The drive to her new residence took nearly an hour. Winding through streets Camilla knew well, but now saw through different eyes. London at night had always seemed magical to her, the lights reflecting off the Thames, the historic buildings illuminated against dark skies. Tonight it felt foreign and slightly hostile. She was moving through a city that knew her story, that had judged her guilty in the court of public opinion. Before any legal proceedings had even begun, Margaret sat beside her in silence, occasionally checking her phone and responding to messages. Camilla appreciated her discretion. There was nothing to say that would make this situation better, no platitudes that would ease the weight of what had happened. The silence felt more honest than empty reassurances. They were both professionals dealing with an unprecedented crisis, and words felt inadequate to the moment. The new residence turned out to be a townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place that wealthy people owned but rarely actually lived in. It had been secured on short notice through connections Margaret had, someone who owed someone a favor. The house was furnished but impersonal, decorated in the bland style of properties meant for short-term lets. Still, it was private and comfortable, a sanctuary where Camilla could hide from the world for however long this nightmare lasted. Margaret gave her a tour of the space, pointing out basics like the kitchen and bedroom. Security had already been through to ensure everything was safe and appropriate for someone in Camilla's position. The windows had special film that prevented anyone from seeing in while still allowing light. There was a panic button installed by the front door, connected directly to police dispatch. Cameras covered the exterior, but Margaret assured her there were none inside respecting her. Privacy. After Margaret left with promises to call first thing in the morning, Camilla found herself truly alone for the first time since this ordeal began. She walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing on hardwood floors. This house felt like a stage set, a temporary backdrop for a life that wasn't really hers. She had gone from palace apartments filled with history and personal touches to this anonymous space in less than a week. Her personal belongings would arrive tomorrow, Charles had said. Until then, she had only what Margaret had brought: a few changes of clothes, basic toiletries, her phone and charger. She had no books, no photographs, none of the small objects that make a space feel lived in. She was starting over with nothing, as if her entire previous existence had been erased. Camilla made herself tea in the unfamiliar kitchen, searching through cabinets for cups and finding generic white mugs that could have come from anywhere. The tea helped settle her nerves slightly. She carried it to the living room and sat on a sofa that was comfortable but utterly characterless. She couldn't turn on the television, couldn't bear to see her own face staring back at her from news broadcasts. Instead, she sat in the quiet and tried to process everything that had happened. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, mostly from numbers she didn't recognize. Journalists had somehow gotten her personal number and were bombarding her with interview requests. There were also messages from people she knew or had thought she knew. Some offered support, others were clearly fishing for information they could share with others. She turned off the phone entirely, needing the silence more than she needed connection to the outside world. Sleep came eventually, though it was restless and broken. The strange bed, the unfamiliar sounds of a new house, and the ankle monitor digging into her skin all conspired to keep her from real rest. She woke repeatedly throughout the night, each time taking a moment to remember where she was and why. The morning light filtering through the windows felt like both a relief and a curse. Another day to survive, another day of uncertainty and fear. The next few days established a grim routine. Camilla woke late, having nowhere to go and nothing to do. She made herself eat, though food had lost all appeal. She avoided the internet entirely, knowing that reading what people were saying about her would only make things worse. Margaret visited daily with updates that were usually just variations on the same theme. The investigation was ongoing. No charges had been filed yet. Public interest remained intense. Her belongings arrived from the palace in a series of boxes that filled the small entrance hall. Camilla spent an entire day unpacking, handling familiar objects that now felt like relics from another life. There were photographs from royal engagements, gifts she had received over the years, clothes that seemed ridiculously formal for her current situation. She arranged things in her new space, trying to make it feel less temporary, but it was a futile effort. Nothing could make this place feel like home. The isolation was the hardest part. Camilla had always been surrounded by people staff, advisors, other family members, the constant activity of palace life. Now she was alone, except for Margaret's visits and the mandatory check-ins at the police station. She wasn't allowed to contact anyone connected to the case, which ruled out most people she knew. Former friends kept their distance, not wanting to be associated with scandal. She understood, even if it hurt. She tried to fill her days with mundane activities. She read books Margaret brought her, avoiding anything too serious that might remind her of current circumstances. She watched old movies on a streaming service, losing herself in stories that had nothing to do with her life. She attempted cooking, following recipes with methodical precision, grateful for tasks that required focus and kept her mind occupied. The twice-weekly visits to the police station became a ritual she dreaded. She would dress carefully, trying to look respectable despite everything. Margaret always accompanied her, and they would drive in silence to the station. Camilla would check in with the duty sergeant, confirm her address and compliance with bail conditions, and sign the necessary forms. The officers were professional, but clearly uncomfortable with her presence. She represented something they didn't normally deal with, a reminder that their justice system sometimes had to handle people from rarefied worlds. Media interest showed no signs of fading. If anything, it intensified as journalists dug deeper into the story. They found people willing to speak about Camilla, former staff members and distant acquaintances who claimed to have seen warning signs. Many of these accounts were exaggerated or outright false, but truth seemed irrelevant in the feeding frenzy. The narrative was being written by others, and Camilla was powerless to influence it. Financial experts appeared on television programs to analyze how the fraud had worked. They drew diagrams showing money flowing through complex networks of offshore accounts. Some portrayed Camilla as a willing participant who must have known what was happening. Others suggested she had been an unwitting pawn. But even the sympathetic experts questioned how someone in her position could have been so careless. The implication was clear. Ignorance was not an adequate excuse. Margaret worked tirelessly to prepare their defense. Strategy for whatever legal proceedings might come. She brought in additional lawyers with expertise in financial crime. They spent hours with Camilla, going over every detail of her interactions with the fraudulent advisor, examining every document she had signed. They were looking for proof of her innocence, but also preparing for the possibility that prosecutors might see things differently. 3 weeks after her release on bail, the advisor who had orchestrated the fraud was finally located. He had fled to a country with no extradition treaty, believing himself safe from prosecution. But international pressure, combined with local authorities who didn't want to harbor a fugitive, led to his arrest. The news brought Camilla a small measure of hope. If he could be brought back to face justice, surely that would help prove she had been a victim too. But hope was quickly tempered by reality. The advisor, now in custody, began cooperating with investigators. Through his lawyers, he provided information about the scheme and everyone involved. Some of his claims implicated Camilla more directly than she had feared. He suggested she had known more than she claimed, that some of her questions had indicated awareness of the questionable nature of the arrangements. His word against hers, and his version made her look guilty. Margaret warned her that charges were now more likely than not. The prosecutors had enough to build a case if they chose to. The advisor's testimony, combined with the documents bearing her signature, created a picture of someone who at minimum had been grossly negligent in her oversight duties. Whether that rose to the level of criminal culpability would be for courts to decide. But the possibility was real and terrifying. Camilla asked what would happen if she were formally charged. Margaret explained the process matter-of-factly. There would be an arraignment where charges would be read, and she would enter a plea. Bail would likely continue with the same conditions. Then months of pre-trial proceedings, motions, and negotiations. Eventually, perhaps a year or more down the line, a trial, if no plea agreement was reached. The prospect of this stretching on for years was almost unbearable. They discussed the possibility of a plea deal. If prosecutors offered one, it might involve Camilla pleading guilty to lesser charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She would have a criminal record, but possibly avoid prison time. The idea made her physically ill. Pleading guilty would mean admitting wrongdoing, accepting blame for things she still believed were not her fault. But it might also mean ending this nightmare sooner, avoiding a public trial that would drag everything out even more painfully. As spring turned to summer, Camilla's life contracted to the boundaries of her bail conditions. She was allowed to go to certain places at certain times, always wearing the ankle monitor that tracked her movements. She went to medical appointments, to her lawyer's office for meetings, to the police station for check-ins. These limited excursions were her only contact with the outside world beyond Margaret's visits. She began to understand how prisoners must feel, counting down time with no clear end date in sight. Each day was another box checked off the calendar, another 24 hours survived. She found herself sleeping more and more, not from tiredness, but from a desire to make time pass faster. Waking hours were filled with anxiety and regret, but sleep offered temporary escape from both. The palace had moved on without her, as she knew it would. There were new headlines about other members of the family, other events and engagements that captured public attention. Her scandal was becoming old news, which should have been a relief, but somehow felt worse. She was being forgotten, becoming irrelevant even in her own disgrace. The world had judged her, found her wanting, and was now looking elsewhere for entertainment. Margaret brought news in late August that made Camilla's heart sink. Prosecutors had decided to file formal charges. She would be accused of fraud, money laundering, and breach of fiduciary duty. The charges were serious, carrying potential prison sentences measured in years if convicted. The arraignment was scheduled for the following week. After months of waiting and uncertainty, the legal machinery was finally grinding into motion. The night before her arraignment, Camilla lay awake, thinking about how far she had fallen. 6 months ago, she had been at the center of royal life, respected and influential. Now she was about to stand in a courtroom as a defendant, accused of crimes she still struggled to fully comprehend. The trajectory of her life had changed so completely and so quickly that it felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's story unfold. She thought about the children's hospital that would now never be built, at least not with the funds that had been lost to the fraud. She thought about the other charitable causes that had been affected, the good work that couldn't happen because money had been stolen. These were the real victims, and she would carry that guilt regardless of what any court decided. Legal innocence, if she could achieve it, wouldn't erase the harm that had been done. Margaret arrived early on the morning of the arraignment, bringing clothes appropriate for court. A conservative navy suit, simple jewelry, sensible shoes. Camilla dressed carefully, understanding that appearance mattered. She needed to look respectable and remorseful without appearing theatrical. The media would scrutinize every detail of her outfit, looking for signs of arrogance or appropriate humility. Even her clothing choices were now subject to judgment and interpretation. The drive to the courthouse took them through streets lined with barriers and police officers. Media presence was overwhelming, camera crews from around the world positioned to capture her arrival. This was a spectacle, entertainment masquerading as justice. Camilla kept her eyes forward as the car pulled up to a secure entrance. Margaret had arranged for them to enter away from the main media presence. But there were still journalists and photographers who had figured out the alternative route. Inside the courthouse, Camilla was processed through security like any other defendant. Metal detectors, identification, verification, instructions on where to go and when. The formality of it felt degrading after a lifetime of different treatment. But she moved through it all with as much dignity as she could muster, determined not to show how frightened she truly was. This was just the beginning, Margaret had warned her. The real ordeal lay ahead. The courtroom was smaller than Camilla had imagined. Nothing like the grand judicial spaces shown in movies. It was functional and plain, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh glow. She sat at the defense table beside Margaret and the rest of her legal team, acutely aware of the people filling the public gallery behind her. Journalists with notebooks, curious onlookers who had queued for hours to witness her humiliation. And perhaps a few who still believed she deserved fairness. The prosecutor was a woman in her 50s, gray-haired and sharpened, with a reputation for meticulous preparation. She sat across the courtroom reviewing papers, occasionally conferring with her assistants in quiet tones. She didn't look at Camilla, which somehow felt more ominous than direct confrontation. This was business for her, another case in a career built on holding powerful people accountable. Personal feelings were irrelevant to the work. When the judge entered, everyone stood in unison. He was an older man with stern features, someone who had clearly presided over countless arraignments over his long career. He took his seat, arranged his papers, and began the proceedings with efficient formality. The charges were read aloud, each one landing like a physical blow. Fraud, money laundering, breach of fiduciary duty. Words that would define her for the rest of her life, regardless of whether she was ultimately convicted. Camilla was asked to stand and confirm her identity. Her voice came out steady despite the trembling she felt throughout her body. Yes, she was who they said she was. Yes. She understood the charges against her. When asked how she pleaded, she spoke clearly into the microphone. Not guilty. The words felt both truthful and inadequate. She wasn't guilty of intentional wrongdoing, but she was guilty of poor judgment, misplaced trust, of failing to ask questions that might have prevented all of this. The bail hearing that followed was tense. The prosecutor argued that, despite being released pending investigation, Camilla posed a flight risk given her international connections and access to resources. She pointed to the fact that the original advisor had fled the country, suggesting others involved might attempt the same. Margaret countered that Camilla had cooperated fully, surrendered her passport, and had complied perfectly with all bail conditions for months. Flight was not a realistic concern. The judge considered both arguments. Before ruling that bail would continue under the same conditions, Camilla felt relief wash over her, though it was quickly replaced by anxiety about everything still to come. She would remain under house arrest, essentially, tracked by the ankle monitor, limited in where she could go and who she could see, but she wouldn't be held in custody pending trial, which was something to be grateful for. Outside the courthouse, Margaret held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps. Camilla stood beside her, facing a sea of cameras and shouted questions. Margaret read a prepared statement asserting Camilla's innocence and expressing confidence in the judicial process. She emphasized that being charged was not the same as being convicted, that everyone deserved the presumption of innocence. The journalist seemed unmoved by these appeals to fairness. Already writing tomorrow's headlines in their minds, Camilla said nothing during the press conference, as Margaret had instructed. Anything she said would be dissected and potentially used against her later. Better to remain silent and dignified, to let the lawyers speak and the courts decide. But the silence felt like cowardice, like she was hiding rather than defending herself. She wanted to shout at them all that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that she had been trying to help people. But she stayed quiet, knowing that her truth wouldn't matter to most of them anyway. The drive back to the townhouse felt longer than the journey there. Adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Camilla slumped in her seat, staring out the tinted windows at a world that felt increasingly disconnected from her own existence. People went about their daily lives completely unaware that just feet away sat someone whose life had imploded spectacularly. The contrast between their normalcy and her chaos felt almost surreal. That evening, Margaret stayed late to discuss strategy going forward. The prosecution would now begin discovery, sharing evidence they intended to use at trial. The defense would do the same, though they had less to share. They would file motions, challenge evidence, negotiate with prosecutors about potential plea deals. It would be months before trial actually began, maybe longer. The legal system moved slowly, grinding through procedures and technicalities, while Camilla's life remained suspended in uncertainty. They talked about what trial might look like if it came to that. The prosecution would call the fraudulent advisor as a witness, despite his own criminal culpability. They would present forensic accountants who would explain the money trail in excruciating detail. They would likely call some of Camilla's former staff members who had witnessed her signing documents or authorizing transactions. The case they would build would be thorough and damning. The defense strategy would focus on Camilla's lack of criminal intent. They would argue she had been deceived by a sophisticated fraudster who exploited her trust and position. They would bring in their own financial experts to explain how complex these schemes could be, how even intelligent people could be fooled. They would paint her as a victim, which felt humiliating even if it might be legally accurate. But pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Margaret left around midnight, promising to call with any updates. Alone again, Camilla found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept replaying moments from the arraignment, the weight of standing before a judge accused of crimes. She had watched similar proceedings on television over the years, never imagining she would be the defendant. The shame of it was almost unbearable. The following weeks brought a deluge of media analysis. Legal experts debated the strength of the prosecution's case on television programs. Some predicted conviction, others suggested reasonable doubt could prevail. Former prosecutors and defense. Attorneys argued about strategy and likely outcomes, treating her life like a game to be analyzed and predicted. She tried not to watch these programs, but sometimes couldn't help herself. Morbidly drawn to seeing what strangers thought of her situation. Public opinion remained divided, those skewed heavily toward assuming her guilt. Social media comments were particularly brutal. People who knew nothing about her, or the case making definitive pronouncements about her character and culpability. Some still defended her, arguing for patience and fairness, but they were drowned out by louder voices demanding punishment. The court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. Discovery proceeded slowly through autumn. Prosecutors turned over thousands of pages of financial records, emails, and witness statements. Margaret's team worked through it all methodically, looking for inconsistencies or exculpatory evidence. They found some useful material. Emails from the advisor that supported Camilla's claim of being deceived. Expert opinions questioning whether her actions met the legal standard for fraud. But they also found things that were harder to explain. Warnings she had received from staff members that she seemed to have ignored. Questions she had asked that indicated more awareness than she remembered. Camilla spent hours with her legal team going through these documents, trying to reconstruct what she had been thinking at various points. Memory was unreliable, she discovered, especially when trying to recall specific conversations from 2 or 3 years earlier. She had been making dozens of decisions every day, juggling multiple responsibilities. The financial arrangements had been just one concern among many, but prosecutors would present it as if she had focused on nothing else, as if every warning sign should have been obvious and impossible to miss. As winter approached, plea deal negotiations began in earnest. A prosecution offered a deal. Plead guilty to negligence and breach of fiduciary duty, avoid the fraud and money laundering charges. In exchange, they would recommend probation instead of prison time. She would lose her position permanently, likely face significant financial penalties, but she wouldn't be incarcerated. It was designed to be tempting, a way out of the nightmare that avoided the worst possible outcomes. Margaret presented the offer neutrally, outlining the pros and cons. Accepting meant certainty. An end to the legal proceedings, a chance to start rebuilding her life sooner. Rejecting meant rolling the dice at trial, risking conviction on more serious charges that carried mandatory prison time. But accepting also meant admitting guilt, accepting a criminal record, confirming in the public mind that she had done something wrong. The decision felt impossible. Camilla asked for time to think about it. She spent days weighing her options. Talking through scenarios with Margaret and her legal team, they couldn't tell her what to do, could only provide their professional assessment of risks and probabilities. In the end, this was her life and her decision. She thought about what she could live with, what she could tolerate as the final word on her actions and character. The holidays arrived, bringing a strange cognitive dissonance. The world celebrated while Camilla marked time in her temporary residence, still waiting for her life to resume or definitively end. She had nowhere to go for Christmas, no family gatherings or traditional celebrations. Margaret invited her to spend the day with her family, a kind gesture that Camilla declined. She couldn't face being around normal holiday happiness, couldn't pretend everything was fine while her future hung in the balance. She spent Christmas Day alone, eating a simple meal she prepared for herself. Through the window, she could see neighbors coming and going, carrying gifts and cheerful expressions. Their lives continued normally, while hers remained frozen. The isolation was crushing, but it also felt appropriate somehow. This was her reality now, and there was no point pretending otherwise. In the new year, Camilla made her decision about the plea deal. After weeks of agonizing consideration, she decided to reject it. But she couldn't admit to crimes she didn't believe she had committed, couldn't accept a permanent criminal record for what she still saw as mistakes rather than malice. It was risky, possibly foolish, but it felt like the only choice that allowed her to maintain some sense of self-respect. She would take her chances at trial and accept whatever consequences came. Margaret wasn't surprised by the decision. She had sensed that Camilla was heading this way, had seen the determination building despite the fear. They began preparing in earnest for trial, which was now scheduled for late spring. Witnesses needed to be interviewed, experts retained, arguments refined and practiced. The next several months would be consumed by preparation for the few weeks in court that would determine everything. The trial preparation was grueling. Camilla spent hours being interrogated by her own lawyers, practicing for cross-examination by the prosecution. They asked her the hardest questions she could imagine, pressed on her weakest points, tried to shake her story. It was necessary but emotionally devastating. Every session left her feeling exposed and vulnerable, uncertain whether she could withstand the real thing when it came. They hired a jury consultant to help with selection and strategy. This person explained that jurors would bring preconceptions about wealth, privilege, and royalty into the courtroom. Some would be predisposed to distrust someone from Camilla's background, while others might be more sympathetic. The defense needed to humanize her, make her relatable rather than remote. She needed to show genuine remorse and humility without appearing to be performing these emotions for strategic purposes. Camilla also worked with a media consultant who helped prepare her for the public aspects of trial. There would be cameras everywhere, analysts discussing her appearance and demeanor. She needed to look serious and respectful without appearing overly dramatic. Her clothing choices, her expressions, even how she walked in and out of the courthouse would all be scrutinized and interpreted. It felt ridiculous to worry about such superficial things when her freedom was at stake, but perception mattered in ways that rational argument sometimes didn't. As spring arrived, the trial date loomed larger. Camilla felt a strange mix of dread and relief. The waiting was almost worse than facing whatever would come. At least during trial, she would have some agency, some ability to present her side of the story. The months of isolation and powerlessness had been corrosive to her mental health. She needed this to move forward, regardless of direction. The night before trial began, Camilla couldn't sleep at all. She lay in bed watching shadows move across the ceiling, her mind racing through everything that would happen in the coming weeks. She thought about the jury members who would decide her fate, strangers who would hear both sides and render judgment. She thought about the media coverage that would dissect every moment. She thought about what prison would be like if she was convicted, how she would survive that horror if it came to pass. But mostly she thought about how she had ended up here. The decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time but had led to catastrophe. The people she had trusted who had betrayed that trust. The position she had held that made her both powerful and vulnerable. She couldn't change any of it now. She could only face whatever came next with as much courage and dignity as she could muster. Morning arrived with gray skies and rain, whether that matched Camilla's mood perfectly. She dressed in the outfit Margaret had selected, ate breakfast, though it tasted like dust, and tried to prepare herself mentally for the day ahead. This was it. After months of waiting and uncertainty, the trial would finally begin. Her fate would be decided in a courtroom by 12 people who didn't know her, but would judge her anyway. The drive to the courthouse took them through familiar streets that now felt alien. Camilla watched London pass by, wondering if this would be one of her last times, seeing it as a free woman. Prison was a real possibility, years of her life potentially taken away. But even more than that, she feared the verdict itself, the official determination of guilt or innocence. Whatever the jury decided would become the truth, at least in legal terms. She would have to live with that verdict for the rest of her life. At the courthouse, they entered through the secure entrance again. The building was crowded with journalists, supporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to witness this spectacle, to be present for the fall of someone who had once seemed untouchable. Camilla kept her head high as she walked through the corridors to the courtroom, flanked by Margaret and her legal team. This was her moment to fight back, to tell her story, to seek the justice she believed she deserved. Whether she would find it remained to be seen, but at least the waiting was finally over. The trial had begun, and whatever happened next, her life would never be the same.